Alors, on est ravis de vous recevoir aujourd'hui pour la conférence Bridges Between Art and Science for Ecological Healing. This conference is part of the exhibition Terrarium that you can visit here on the first floor. So my name is Laetitia and I'm the event and tour manager here at Age of Union. Je vais continuer la présentation en anglais vu que la conférence sera toute en anglais aujourd'hui. I would just like to acknowledge that the center is located on the unceded indigenous lands belonging to the Garingayaga, Haudenosaunee, and St. Lawrence Iroquois nations, the custodians of the lands and water on which we gather. Jungjae is historically known as the gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other people. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and futures in our ongoing relationship with indigenous and other people within the Jungjae community, and are thankful for the ability to create, collaborate, play, and work here. So I will pass the mic to Damian Siqueiros, who is the moderator of the presentation today. Have a good conference.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to receive you today. So we've been creating this series of conferences. This is our third conference. The first ones were on ecological sustainability in the arts. The second one was in social sustainability in the arts. And one of the big pillars of Terrarium is science. And I have to say that, for you to understand the importance of, the two people that I have to my right, these are my Beyonce and my Madonna. So it's just like, I'm... decide which, you can fight over who's the diva between the two. Really, I'm an artist, and science is not my primary practice. I grew up in a scientific household. Everyone around me was a scientist, so it's a big part of my influence. But in this particular project, for me, it was really important that I had this very grounded feeling to the ideas that we were putting forward, especially because when you take an optimistic view of what you can do in terms of affecting climate change or social sustainability, a lot of the time you can be considered Pollyannish or naive. And when I started to read David's work and Elena Bennett's work, I felt that realistic optimism in the work as well. It's not necessarily about saying like, we're gonna fix everything, everything is gonna be all right. It's not about that, but putting ideas forward about the solutions to, one of the biggest crises that we faced as humanity. So in that sense, I prefer to hear my guests than myself. So with my other guest, I've actually asked them to introduce themselves rather than to give like a boring biography or, in their case, a big list of prizes that they had. So I would like to hear you. How would you present yourselves to the world? Again, Elena Bennett and David Grinspoon. So can we start by Elena? Can you introduce yourself?
Sure. So that's okay? The mic? Okay, let me make sure I'm doing it right. So my name is Elena. I used to live in Montreal. Now I live in Hudson, so not far away. I work as a professor at McGill. I'm a mom of 2 kids, and I think I came to this kind of work that I'm doing now from a place in part of watching some of my students really struggle with a lot of climate grief and a lot of very real sadness, and wanting to kind of acknowledge that sadness and make a place for that sadness, but then not necessarily wallow in it, but want to do something with it or about it or for it. And that, I think for me in part, was kind of the impetus to this okay, we've got a problem. What are we going to do about it? What am I going to do about it? So that's, I think, what brings me here. How about you, David?
I'm David Grinspoon, and my background is in planetology, planetary science. So I study other planets, but a big part of that is gaining insight on the Earth through what we call comparative planetology. And a lot of what I've done for my sort of published science is climate modeling, but of other planets. But we use a lot of the same techniques that we use to model climate features on Earth, but trying to understand the stories of Venus and Mars and other planets and how they compare to each other and to Earth. And through that process, what we can learn of sort of more potentially universal principles of how planets work. And then out of that has grown what we call astrobiology, trying to understand the prevalence of life in the universe, where it might exist. And of course, a lot of that involves studying life on Earth, because it's the only planet we know of that has life, but then trying to see how we can apply that elsewhere. So one thing that's come out of astrobiology is I think some new insights into the relationship between life and planets, including Earth. And you've probably heard of the Gaia hypothesis, which is sort of the notion of, in a sense, looking at the totality of Earth's biosphere as one large organism, or at least something that you can understand as having the properties, organismic properties, that give it different qualities than you would than it would have if you were just considering it an assemblage of individual species on an otherwise lifeless planet. But the interesting thing is the Gaia hypothesis came out in part of people trying to understand the difference between living and non-living planets. So I've thought a lot about that, and through astrobiology, I feel like I have a somewhat different perspective on life on Earth and its long history. And then out of that, more recently meaning in the last 15 years, I've tried to focus on this question of the Anthropocene, which I'm sure we'll get into today, which is this new period of Earth history in which humans have become, whether we like it or not, kind of a dominant force of changing the planet. And what does it mean for a species to take on that role? And if we see ourselves in that larger planetological context, how does that change the way we see ourselves? And does it give us any useful perspective on how we approach this strange time we're at, where we find ourselves as something we didn't necessarily seek, but now we have this role of being kind of planet changers, and what are we going to do with that? Is there some wisdom that can come out of that larger view? So that anyways, that's the story of maybe why I'm here, even though I'm somebody that studies other planets.
Thank you. So the program for today is historical perspectives of climate change, scientific initiatives to confront it, and visualization of possible positive futures. So again, a lot of the narratives that we're trying to construct through the work that you can see on the other room and some of the goals of Terrarium are based precisely in the idea that what we're trying to create and the visions that we have are not completely utopic. The power of art is that it helps us reimagine things in a way that it's not necessarily attached to a certain reality. So, that advantage that we have over science as artists is to imagine worlds that, might not exist or have less possibility of existing. But if you mix both of them, you have that root of, or that good footing in order to make people see it and then make it a reality. So imagine that you're playing darts and you're blindfolded. It's going to be very hard for you to get to the point where you have to get, to the center. So in terms of fighting climate change or the climate crisis or social issues, if you have a clear view of what where you want to go, if you have a visualization of that future, it's going to be easier to get there, you know. A lot of the narratives about technology and science we've seen first in, you know, in literary work or in television. You know, cell phones existed first in TV, or you know, traveling to space was first in literary works. So this is what we're trying to do. Let's go to the question. So, okay, so we can start into the nitty-gritty of the talk. So, first of all, like, let's talk about the idea of the Anthropocene, because, you know, when we talk about it, or when, you know, like, people that are smarter than me talk about it, it's like, yeah, but the Anthropocene, like, don't be arrogant, and, you know, like, we don't have the capability of affecting the world. Like, why are we putting our name into an era? It's not an era, it's an epoch, and all of these things. Like, so the question is, are we too fixated on semantics? Why is there no era named after cyanobacteria, for example? That, you know, it's one of the reasons why we're here, because of the oxygen. So anyone wants to tackle this?
Well, maybe I'll start. And, you know, I think a few things. So one, I think it really is important that to have a way to acknowledge how dominant our effect is on so many different aspects of how the planet works. So to me, it's really important to have a word, whether it's a formally accepted by the geologist's definition or not, but to have a way to say, yes, there's something happening. Yes, it's us. Opens the door to then being able to say, okay, so what are we going to do about it? What kind of relationship do we want to have with the planet? Because if you just say, well, it's not us, or, you know, don't acknowledge it, then you can't do anything with it. And I think the other thing in my mind is it really is a difference. So if we look climatically at the long history, say hundreds of thousands of years, you see climate bounce around all over the place. There's highs, there's lows, there's a lot of variability. And then in the last 10,000 years or so post Ice Age, it's remarkably stable. You get, you know, what is officially called the Holocene, the stability, and that's everything we know of human history, right? Like, that allows people to settle, that allows there to be agriculture, that allows there to be civilization. Romans, Greeks, Renaissance, all of that stuff comes out of that stability. And when I look now at what we're seeing in the climatic records, we are heading out of that stability. And it feels very important to me to mark that and say, this is now different from the kind of planet that allowed there to be basically everything we know about how people have survived on the planet. What do we want it to look like? Because it might not look like climate stability, but it might be able to look like something where we can survive or even thrive, or where other species can survive and thrive. So to me, that's why I feel like this Anthropocene word is so important.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the cyanobacteria probably deserve their own, you know, they they were major players in creating the world that we live in, and as you say, that they were responsible for the beginning of oxygenating the atmosphere. So that was a major change. You know, we're in the process of another major change now, and there has been a lot of people have challenged this: should we name a geologic epoch after ourselves? Is that arrogant? And it is disturbing, but it's disturbing. The truth is disturbing. The fact that we are in a new geologic epoch that we are responsible for. So I agree with what Elena said, that I think it is important to name it, not out of self-aggrandizement, because we're so great, we've created a new, look at us, but as an acceptance of, as a recognition of what's happening. You have to look at it clearly if you want it. That's where it's the acceptance of responsibility starts. And so I think naming it in a way that acknowledges our role is really important. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we are being self-aggrandizing. In fact, the more we talk about the Anthropocene and that responsibility, the more we realize, like, wow, we don't exactly know how to handle this responsibility, and that's something we have to learn in a hurry. So it's not necessarily saying, oh, we're so great, we've got this, but it is saying, hey, this is the situation we're in, what are we going to do about it? So I think in that sense it is a really positive thing to label it in that way.
Yeah, I think that, as you mentioned, it's a recognition, more than a self-aggrandizement, is a recognition of our responsibility and taking the task to fix what we've done, and to have this role of stewardship as well in terms of, like looking out for nature in a way. If we go to the second question, like sometimes one of the beefs that I have with certain scopes of studying nature and ecosystems is that we see them in terms of ecosystem services. So this, like for people that are not scientists or are not related, like don't know, recognize this phrase or this concept of ecosystem services, is like, what is nature giving us? How does it help us thrive, or how do we use nature in a way? And I'm using the word use in a very specific way, in terms of exploitation. So part of the work that I'm trying to do is for people to see nature as something else, as something utilitarian, something that we can exploit, and like, let's save the bees because otherwise you are not going to have food. It's let's save the bees because they're bees and they have the right to exist. So the question is, can science define a relationship with nature beyond ecosystem services? What would be the alternative?
Yeah, this ecosystem services framing always makes me a little bit queasy, honestly, because it's kind of saying, hey, we should really not destroy the Earth and its natural systems because they're worth a lot of money. So it's bad business which is true, I suppose. But to me, it doesn't really cut to the heart of why we're concerned about things, and it doesn't really cut to the heart of why we do science and what science can do for us. I mean, honestly, I think the scientific impulse ultimately comes out of wonder and sort of awe of the universe and curiosity, and in my field, that's why we're exploring the planets, because we want to understand our role in the universe and where we are, and it's curiosity. And you can, there are, of course, more cynical ways to frame it. The Cold War, we wanted to show our rockets were bigger than the Soviets' rockets, so we were launching them into space. And, that's all true, but I think the nature of a scientist is to just want to know and be filled with awe of the universe. And then it's sort of fortuitous that knowledge comes back and is actually useful to us. It's like, wow, we're learning cool stuff just because it's cool, but it also helps us understand our planet in ways that can help us survive. I get the ecosystem services framing. It's useful as a utilitarian way to try to get the attention of people who think in terms of money and value, and this is why we should seek to preserve things. But to me, science is much more about making connections and trying to have a deep understanding. And out of that deep understanding of the planet, I think does come a natural set of responses which promote sustainability, because the more you know in a deep way about those connections between all life and between what it will really take for humans to create a sustainable society, that knowledge creates the desire to move society into behaving in a certain way, which to me doesn't really translate into simply ecosystem services.
Interesting. So I think when I look at the sort of how do we define our relationship to nature, I probably wouldn't go in through the science part of myself. I would go in through that's like art and humanity and hiking, it's all sorts of physicality and all sorts of other things that for me maybe help me define what is the relationship between me and nature, or even what is the relationship I want to have between me and nature. I might use something like ecosystem services to try to understand, well, where am I at right now relative to the relationship that I want to have? How am I doing? Because that can be hard to measure. We can measure that maybe through how much impact are we having on climate change, or how much impact are we having on biodiversity. And I think that term came about as a way to start trying to get a handle on where are we relative to where we want to be. It doesn't do everything, but I probably would start in and say, okay, I'm not going to define my relationship based on science, even though I like the idea of awe. That's an interesting way in, but maybe define the relationship and then look to science to help figure out, well, what ought I to do or not do to build the relationship that I want to have, and maybe not only to science for that.
Yeah, I think, thank you for those answers. I think that, one of the reasons why I really like your presence or your work was precisely because I saw that human component to the work that you're doing. And it's strange that you define yourself as being sort of separate when you want to enjoy nature and relate to nature. I would have not think that from someone that works on nature through science, Sort of a follow-up question, because sustainability is a concept that we are throwing all the time, in terms of, we have to become sustainable. But I wonder if the concept of sustainability includes the idea of thriving with nature as well, or it's just more about maintaining a way of living that doesn't necessarily affect nature or impacts it negatively. So can we grow out of sustainability in terms of let's strive together, or should we just use the same word?
So one thing I think that a picture that sustainability paints for us, and maybe that we've painted for ourselves, is that there is some good end point that we're striving to get to, and then we're going to get there and it will be done. And I think we do this, and it's not to say that these things aren't important, right? But we set these goals about, how much greenhouse gas emissions are we going to allow or not allow, or how much nature are we going to protect or not protect, with a sense that things are relatively static, or we're gonna get to that end. And I think it's really important to force ourselves to realize that things are always changing, and not just us, but nature around us is always changing. We're not likely to get to an end point. And so that then steps me back to this thing of relationships, because, that's a thing I think that we more easily acknowledge. Our relationships with our kids or our partner or our friends, those things are also always changing because they're influenced by the situation that we find ourselves in, or how the world around us is changing. And so I'd like to get us to a place where we can think about our ever-changing relationship with nature and how we want that to look, because I think it gets us to a place where we have more space to acknowledge that we're not going to be able to solve this and put it aside and then say, okay, now let's work on the next problem because we've fixed that one, because things are going to keep changing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think of it in terms of a necessary change in our relationship with nature, and on certain more optimistic days, I think that change, in a way, in a slow, halting way, is in progress. But it's learning to integrate ourselves within the functioning of the planet, not to ignore it, not to like sort of relinquish our. I mean, it's an interesting question. You know, what should our long-term relationship with technology and world-changing technology and the planet be? And you know, one possibility as well, we should just stop using technology because that hasn't worked very well and go back to being just another animal species. That doesn't seem very realistic, and certainly it would mean letting a large percentage of the human race die off, because I don't think we can support anything like a population of many billions of people without some kind of a high-tech civilization. But if you look at the way the world functions, you know, putting aside human activity for a second, there is this tremendous cyclic activity and sort of self-renewing quality to the Earth and to the biosphere. And so I see it as learning to integrate ultimately our technological activities into that kind of a system, so that we don't have to have zero presence on the planet. That's not realistic. But our presence needs to be one where it's done with enough knowledge of the way the natural systems work, so that we're sort of working with them rather than against them. And so then it's much bigger than just climate change or this problem or that problem. And yeah, it's not seeking a static goal, but it's learning to recalibrate that relationship so that our knowledge, our increasing knowledge of the natural world, becomes then knowledge of how we can integrate ourselves into it over the long term without having any deleterious effects in that way.
I would like to go a bit into what you do, like the core of your work and your visions for the future. So feel free to include any solutions that you see viable. And we'll start with Elena. She has this amazing initiative called Seeds of a Good Anthropocene, and then we'll go to Terra Sapiens. So Elena, I don't know if you want to talk to us about, yeah.
Sure. This is a project that actually grew out of some work that I did with Kara Raudsap-Hearn, who's in the audience today. Whoop, whoop. And it really, just to build on what you were just saying, David, came for me in part, I mean, from a whole bunch of places, but one was wanting to figure out ways that we could be as a species not only just not a problem, but actually a source for good. And there just is some very deep part of myself that wants to believe that there is a place on the planet for people that is positive. So it's not just, well, we've got to protect nature and we've got to keep people out of there because people are bad, and we're going to protect things by, you know, the nature is over there and the people are over here. But, you know, where's the place where we can figure out where people and nature really thrive together? And maybe it's not everywhere. Maybe we need some places where people and nature are separate, but maybe we also need some places where we're doing something that is helping nature thrive. And so this project was all about trying to find examples from all over the world of people trying to do that, trying to create transformation towards a better future, towards a thriving future, in their own way. We have about 1,000 of them now. A lot in Montreal, because we've done a lot in Montreal recently. We will unveil a map of those soon. And trying to learn from them also, right? So trying to understand what makes them successful, what is it about them, and then use them to think about envisioning more positive futures. You know, what is the future that we want? Because if we look around this room, there are, I don't know how many of us there are, but however many of us are, there's probably twice that many visions of what a good future would look like, right? My vision is not going to be the same as anybody else's in this room. It's going to have some different piece, and the same for all of you. And so, how do we value all of those different visions and yet navigate ourselves on some pathway forward, away from some of the more problematic things that we find ourselves doing, or problematic relationships that we have with nature and with each other, and towards something that looks more like the future that we want to have.
Are there any initiatives that you want to highlight, maybe one or two that mark you and that you want to put forward?
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about one that's far away. I'm tempted to talk about one in Montreal, but then it's always like a little bit of, am I going to pick one that somebody else detests for some reason? So I'll pick one that's very far away, that's a little safer for me. And it's a project called Health in Harmony, and it works in Indonesian Borneo. And Kinari Webb, who started this project, who is a physician, and there's a couple things I like about it. One is the project reconnects human health to forest health by basically providing free healthcare to communities that agree to cut down or eliminate illegal logging that was happening in that part of the rainforest. It has been massively successful, saving thousands of hectares of forest, but at the same time, every indicator that they're measuring of human health has also gotten better. So they've got reduced child mortality, reduced rates of diabetes, reduced rates of all of these things that they're tracking. So I think, in terms of success and things, it's a really cool project. The other piece that I just personally like and really relate to is the way that Kinari started this was just by going to this place and listening, and just sort of putting herself in a place where she said, I'm just going to spend a year just figuring out what's going on here, and trying to understand why these forests are getting cut. Is this bad actors? Is it industry? Is it what? And then recognizing through this really intense listening and this really intense empathy that, oh, it's people cutting down trees because they can't afford surgery for their child, or they can't afford elderly care for their grandparent. Okay, now I understand how I can come in and fix this. And I love the idea of listening to figure out what the problem is, probably because I think we scientists are not always so good at that. So that's one for me, that the listening part and the sort of reconnecting a thing that probably was once connected. You, at some point before technology, you couldn't have a healthy community without having a healthy forest. Then when you get grocery stores and technology and you can buy your food from somewhere else, it doesn't matter how healthy your forest is. And so I love the idea of coming in, listening hard, paying attention to people with real empathy for both forest and people, and then using that to get to a solution. And there are plenty of examples like that close by here as well.
And Kinari has a really great book that she wrote about that project. I'm trying to do you remember the title? Anyway, here it's Kinari Webb, W-E-B-B, and I can see on my bookshelf too. I'm blanking on the title, but it's very inspiring, and she talks about radical listening and then what comes out of it. Yeah.
I think that one of the things that I want to really highlight on what Elena said is that you notice that the solution that they are providing in that particular example is integrative. So you don't necessarily say like, oh, we're going to save the forest, and the first thing that you think of is I'm going to give health access to the people that live in the forest. It's like, no, I'm gonna forbid those bad people, from cutting, and logging and doing this stuff. But if you don't fix the root problem and you sort of make the people that are cutting the trees criminals, then you're not solving the issue, because it's just gonna come back and come back and come back. The problem there, a lot of the problem was poverty. Right? That's the source issue. And a lot of the time is gender inequality or racism. So solutions to climate change need to be integrative as well. They need to take into consideration the social aspect of the communities that live in those places. And I mean, not to plug my exhibition because I mean we're here, but basically it's at the crux of what this exhibition is. Like, not to look at people and nature separately. We need to put them together. You solve one thing, you solve the other. If you don't solve, again, gender equality, poverty, and it feels like a bigger task, but when you start to think about it, the puzzle just starts to sort of fill itself. And I'm not saying that it's easy. It just feels easier to address everything at the same time, just instead of siloing different things and not communicating with the other people that are trying to solve the same problem as you are. We can go to your vision. So now it's the vision of Terra Sapiens.
Yeah, so this phrase Terra Sapiens came out of my effort to try to understand sort of what the Anthropocene is from a planetological point of view and what it could be. And as Elena said, I think it's really important for us to have visions of what we're seeking, not just what we're trying to avoid, what we're afraid of, what we're trying to move away from, but what kind of future can we imagine? What do we want? Ultimately, what's our goal in thinking about these things? And in trying to characterize the Anthropocene in terms of the different kinds of changes that can happen on planets, I've realized that I think there are fundamentally two different kinds of Anthropocene changes, and maybe two phases potentially of the Anthropocene, which I call the immature Anthropocene and the mature Anthropocene. And there's a kind of change that's dominated the Anthropocene up to this point, which is inadvertent planetary change by humanity, in that we're not saying, hey, let's change the atmosphere and make the planet warmer, or hey, it's something that we're doing that by participating in something that we're not necessarily aware of the effects of, and has cumulative effects that were not sort of part of the plan. That's what I mean by inadvertent planetary changes. And what I call the immature Anthropocene has been dominated by those kinds of changes. And there's plenty of examples of those. But there's also another kind of Anthropocene transformation, which is intentional planetary change. And we do have some examples of that. And one great example is responding to the ozone layer problem, which is that in the 1970s we realized that by these chemicals that we thought were safe and harmless for refrigerants, these CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, which are safe and harmless down here in the troposphere where we live. But we realized that because they were leaking up into the stratosphere, where they get broken up by ultraviolet light and the little chlorines get knocked off, and then chlorine does something nasty to ozone, it's a classic example of an unintended consequence. And this problem was realized, and some scientists sounded the alarm, and there was a lot of doubt and skepticism and pushback and all the kinds of dynamics we can see at play in a lot of other problems. But ultimately, there was enough of a global conversation and a global realization that this was a problem that there were global agreements that were put in place, and it's working. It's not perfect, but the ozone layer is in process of being healed. So this is an example of what in my lexicon that I write about, called planetary changes of the fourth kind, but really it's intentional global change. And it's sort of a proof of concept, and there are other examples, but that's just a great one. And in my view, what I call the mature Anthropocene would be dominated by that kind of change. So it's humans changing the planet, but not in this sort of willy-nilly accidental way. And then there's another level of this. I won't go way into it now, but if you think of sort of systems analysis, there's where you have positive and negative feedbacks. That's why the maturity analysis is good, because when in an individual, maturity often comes when awareness of the consequences of your actions are integrated into your actions. So a little kid, we say, lacks situational awareness and will harm themselves or harm others, not because they're evil or bad, but because they're not aware of the consequences of their actions. And then maturity, you gain that more awareness and you integrate that into how you behave. So on a planetary level, that's what I mean by sort of the mature Anthropocene. It doesn't have to mean that everything we do is perfect, but that our global actions are dominated by this sort of more intentional approach to our perception of our role and how we work in the world. And that's when I talk about Terra Sapiens, it's sort of that world we can create where that's our main mode ultimately of interacting with the planet, is with an awareness of consequences. And when I talk about it, sometimes it sounds sort of utopian, but this is another thing I've kind of looked at is sort of long-term human history, and that in sort of on an evolutionary time scale. And one thing I think I can make a pretty good case for, and other people have as well, is that one thing that characterizes humans is our great plasticity and our capacity for reinvention, and that our relationship with nature has been completely redefined in the past out of necessity. And there's some examples of that, and that's, I think, really ultimately what we're talking about. To create Terra Sapiens is a sort of redefinition of, and that's, we were talking about relationship before, but of our relationship with nature. And this is, by the way, why I love the seeds framing that Elena brings to it, because we don't know exactly what the game-changing innovations are going to be. And you look at past views of the present. Nobody's good at predicting the future. That's one thing you learn when you read predictions of now from the past. Because the things we always miss are the game changers. And we don't know exactly what they're going to be, but you see these promising endeavors in all these different areas, as Elena does, and you say, well, here's 100 different things that have the potential, if they really blossom, to really help us fix things. And we don't know which one is going to do it, because that's the way it always is. We can't tell, but you encourage all these efforts, and then out of those seeds, some of them really grow into magnificent jungles of possibility. So thank you.
Okay, so because precisely we want to try to talk about these different fields coming into place to work on the climate crisis and social issues, I wanted to ask some questions that relate maybe a little bit more to social issues and related to science. So one of the big things that we are putting into Terrarium is the idea that gender equality is not just including women into the process, but actually including female-led narratives and historically perceived female values into the work, which are compassion, empathy, community building, nourishment. So I wanted to apply this to science in this specific conference. So in your perception, how has the inclusion of women in STEM affected science and specifically the solutions to climate change?
Should we start? Okay. I mean, I'll just pick up on what you were just saying about we don't know what is going to create change in the larger world or in science. And so to me, that just points to a need for a lot of different visions and values and inclusion, whether it's women, whether it's non-binary, other gender issues, whether it's indigenous ways of knowing and thinking about things, those, they just provide a different perspective on something. I have my own perspective, and the scientist down the hall has his own perspective. And the more of those we get, the more angles we've got to view a particular problem or a set of solutions to understand, okay, so what does this solution mean? What would it take to implement this solution? What other problems might that solution create for somebody else or for some other time? And so to me, just the more of those different perspectives we get, the better. And, I think they do sometimes also change just the way science happens or the nature of how science develops at the same time.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. There's a level on which it makes me uncomfortable. Of course, discomfort isn't always bad, because whenever we're sort of assigning and saying these are female values and these are male values, I always kind of worry that, like, are we sure, or is that just our culture? And I don't want to, like, tell little girls and little boys, you should be like this because you're female or you're male or whatever. But on the other hand, it's interesting to think of some of the really important contributions of some of the most important scientists of the last 50 years who do happen to bring a female perspective to things. I think someone like Rachel Carson and her role in ecological thinking becoming so prevalent, and how the gift of that, and someone like a Jane Goodall, who's another big hero of mine, and she brought this compassion and this notion of having a relationship with your subjects. These are, again, seem like kind of canonical female values, and then of course Lynn Margulis, who brought so much to our understanding of the world by recognizing that cooperation and community is every bit important in evolution as competition and fight to the death. So these are all examples that maybe should get me over my discomfort and realize, yeah, these seem like kind of canonical female values that these really important scientists are bringing to the table. And the partnership of Margulis and Lovelock is really interesting and almost kind of classic, because Jim Lovelock was a chemist and had this realization about the way that the world seems to work, but he thought about it in terms of homeostasis and like cybernetics. It's like, yeah, if you have this part of the system and this part of the system, and you can draw a diagram, and it's like there's all these feedbacks, and he sort of saw the world as a system of boxes feeding back on each other, and had a profound insight. But then when he partnered with Margulis, the biologist, she said, well, but actually it's much more profound than that, because the boxes are full of bacteria that are doing all these feeding back and kind of running the world through their sort of innate ability to respond and relate. And she came up with the endosymbiotic theory, which is this whole new way of looking at biology, where collectives are important in evolution. And in a sense, Gaia is the biggest collective of all. It's the entire collective of the Earth. So despite my discomfort in trying to assign roles, I would note that in responding to your question, that a lot of these contributions do seem to come from that place of these sort of what may be sort of typical female values.
I'll add one more, which is Lynn Ostrom, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, who then took some of those ideas. I mean, I see Lynn Margulis, I see a clear trajectory to Ostrom, who was then saying, actually, people and people's social systems can work in the same way of supporting one another and working together to manage a society's relationship with ecosystems. I'm sure we could think of some male examples too, though.
I'm happy that I'm asking uncomfortable questions. Can we go back just a bit? Yeah, and I mean, the way of thinking about these values, David, just to reassure you, is that anyone can embody these values. Being male, female, or anything in between. I mean, these values are universal in a way, but for as long as we can remember in history, they've been assigned, we've been assigned like in a very stark binary in a way. But, the reason to ask this question is precisely to sort of traverse, or the idea that women can bring these values into a general perception of what science needs to be. And it goes into the governance or the direction of which science works as well, And I mean, you already talked a lot about the Gaia theory, this collaboration between Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock. And one of the things that really struck me when I was reading the book and when I was reading about their work is how much it looked like what we now know of indigenous knowledge as well. Like, I don't think neither Lynn or James, I mean, maybe they frame it differently, but it's also a reformulation of what indigenous people think about their land and how they see it function, and not only for indigenous people from North America, but from other places that had animist religions as well. But can you sort of go just a little deeper in terms of what's the sort of the break that is done with that theory? I think that, again, one of the things that for me was really important was the inclusion of poetry, literature. What does it break for the studies of biology and geology when they come?
Well, I mean, a lot of progress historically, traditionally in science has been made by breaking the world into little pieces and looking at little pieces of the world. If you want to know a certain thing about the way plants grow, you take a plant out of nature and you put it in your laboratory and you change all these variables and you see how does it respond to moisture and how does it respond to light or different chemicals in the soil, and you can learn a lot that way. But ultimately, you're not really studying the plant out in nature where it exists and interacts with other plants and interacts with a larger ecology. So I think science got so good at that splintering of the world into separate disciplines and in thinking of things in little pieces, and did make a lot of progress in understanding bits and pieces of important systems. We learned a lot that way, but then maybe we forgot a little bit to kind of put the world back together and see it as a whole. And that's part of the great insight of the ecological thinking and Gaia thinking, is that there are aspects, important aspects, that that life has in its functioning and as on a planetary scale and in relation with the quote non-living part of the planet. And you even realize that distinction between living and non-living is not as solid as we thought when you start thinking in this way. That can only be seen when you see nature as a whole. And to me, that's sort of science kind of rediscovering something that was an indigenous perspective in a lot of places for a long time, which was that seeing things in relation and seeing yourself as part of the world and seeing the world as alive. And then, of course, the multi-generational thinking, which is so important in the kinds of solutions we're talking about, is just embedded, I think, in a lot of indigenous perspectives. And that's, again, something that, we can almost encourage kind of a refocus or a rediscovery of some of these things that indigenous people, this knowledge that indigenous people have been sort of keeping for us all along.
Yeah, I think that, when Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who's a Anishinaabe, she is an ethnobotanist and an indigenous, she talks about her language, and she says the way that you refer to everything around you is either living things and non-living things, but they conceive living things in a different way that everyone else in the West, which is, for us, if it's not breathing, it's not living, right? But for the Anishinaabe people, everything that is man-made is non-living, but everything else that it's done by nature is living. So rocks or lakes or rivers are also living, and I think that's really important. And also the familiarity that David is mentioning, it's also really interesting in the sense that they don't necessarily see birds or a lake as being foreign things, but being part of your family. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, they capitalize the names of the animals or names of bodies of water, et cetera, because they're referring it as if they were another person, like it's, Daddy Mountain, or, like there's this relationship that it's more familial. And I think that's a very good way of reframing our relationship with nature. It's, when we lose nature, it's like losing a member of our family. And my contribution to the female scientist, Susan Simard, has, I don't know if you know Susan Simard, who has a beautiful study of the social life of trees, Canadian as well. So that's, if you want to look for her work, it's amazing. Let's go to the next question. So I think for our last question, we don't have that much time, but what do you see as the possible bridges between science and art to make positive visions for the future a reality? You can answer whatever you want. You can go wherever you want with this question.
Gosh, that's a big question. I mean, the first place that occurs to me comes back to some things we were talking about before, of just sort of understanding who we are and our place in the world and our relationship to it. And I think that's a thing that I think science hasn't been so great at, because we break things down into these little pieces, and I'm just going to look at that piece. And it's a thing that at least in my conception of what art is, that art has always struggled towards understanding who we are in relation to everything else. And at least my conception of where I see some of the most exciting science going right now is really picking up on this sense of life as a system. So you see in Gaia, in some of the other science that we've talked about today, the sense of, oh yes, these things are connected, they're impacting one another, there's a relationship there. And so science, I think, is starting to pick up on this thing that art has always had, of we exist in relation to other things. And my hope is that science figures out a way to kind of build on that, to keep trying to understand the world, but to try to understand it in relation to itself, rather than trying to, pick this plant and put it in the lab, which is what we've traditionally done, and try to understand this piece really well. But it's about, how does this whole system work, and what is my place in this system, and how can I help that system thrive in the way that we think that it should?
Yeah, that's beautifully put. What can I possibly add? I mean, I think that, like, science has been about, strictly speaking, just trying to understand the world, not necessarily trying to prescribe how we should live or how we should respond to the world. But now we're faced with the kinds of questions we're talking about today, with the need to move beyond just, making observations and writing an academic paper about it and say, okay, that's science, I'm done. No, we need to respond to what we see, and science needs to be not just telling us the answers about how to live, but needs to acknowledge that its role and responsibility in being part of that conversation. But that's a much larger thing than just doing science in the way we've always thought of how to do science. And it gets into this dimension of really kind of what I would describe as a spiritual dimension of trying to, in a deep sense, understand how we fit in with the world and what our role is in the world, what we want our role to be in the world. I mean, clearly we need science, but science at least as we've known it up to this point, has never been equipped to address those kinds of sort of spiritual and existential questions. And that's where we need to somehow enlarge that conversation. And art, to me, and I'm not going to try to define art. I do an even poorer job than I do when I try to define science, but clearly it's a response to the world and a response to the question of what it means to be living in the world, and an attempt to communicate in a way that's not strictly narrative and linear, in a way that scientists are used to thinking. But I think the scientists need to pay attention to the way artists respond to the world, because clearly science, as we've always done it, is not adequate. And again, to me, it's that sort of I guess I keep wanting to use the word spiritual, which is another word that's hard for me to define, but I feel like it has to do with these larger questions of how we relate to the world and what it means for us to try to respond to the world using the knowledge we have. And I feel like the artistic impulse to sort of communicate knowledge and feeling about the world in a way that is not strictly sort of analytical and narrative is really is key to that.
Thank you. I'm gonna put my dad on the spot. My dad is a physicist, and whenever I talk to him about these topics, we end up being a little bit tense because his way of seeing things as a scientist is like, my way of looking is factual, therefore it's better than yours, And for me, like throughout my life, as an artist, I felt that precisely that the way that I was looking at things, it was not as important as science, especially when we're dealing with questions as big as this, as the future of humanity. But just mentioning the word humanity in this, art is putting the humanity in everything that it touches, even in science. So in a way, the effort that I'm trying to do with Terrarium is precisely to unite these two ways of seeing. There is this phenomenon called the Rashomon effect, in which, like a bunch of people are in a dark room and there's an elephant in the room and there's like 6 people and they're touching it. And, their touch of the elephant sort of defines the unbelt or the way that they see the world, because it's the only thing that they can touch, it's the only thing that they can perceive. But the only way that they can understand the entirety of the world is by communicating with each other and saying, what we are touching is an elephant, but it needs everybody. And in this case, I think the importance of the art and science and the spirituality and the indigenous knowledge coming together, and then coming also from different ethnocultural perspectives, non-human perspectives, is precisely this Rashomon effect of we're putting this world together in a way that it's more equitable for everyone, right? Okay. I don't know if you have any questions. I will have a ton, but I also want to give you a chance to take advantage of. That sounds a little weird. Take advantage of the time that we have with David and Elena. Don't be shy. Yes, please. Yes, in the middle.
So, what other possible collaborations are being imagined between science and art? Because I heard this term of regenerative art, which are artistic practices that aim to also do ecological restoration. So I'm curious to see if Seeds of Good Anthropocene or anywhere else has been examples of this science-art union.
That's a great question. I would have to look through the database. I'd be surprised if there aren't any, but I don't know offhand of that real art science collaboration where it is, regenerative art or science studying art or art peering at the process of science. But it's a fascinating area.
There are different examples, and just to separate a little bit the different initiatives, there's kind of an art that has sort of a more long-term vision, which is the kind of work that I'm trying to present here, in which we are living more in the world of ideas. So we're presenting a vision for the future. Then there's going to be another category that will have a direct impact in the world, which I think it's the kind of art that you are talking about. There are not that many examples in which we have this translation between the ideas presented in the art and an application of that work. There is for social issues, for example, the resolution of poverty, homelessness, et cetera, especially New York in the 70s with conceptual art and performance, which sometimes is just invite people to the artist studio and feed them, for example. Olaf Eliasson has really beautiful initiatives. One of them was, I think it's called Little Sun. And it's a little bit more related to technology, but it's bringing affordable light to countries where electricity is not readily available for some communities. So a part of his artistic work was to design this little sun, basically, who that takes the energy from the sun, and then at night it helps people do homework or do some home tasks, etc., etc. Another example that I would think, but it's a little bit further, is natural architecture, which is basically using nature to construct sort of biostructures like bridges or houses that are made directly from redirecting the plants or the environment in order to construct architectural structures. So that's how I feel the best integration of art and science.
I just had an idea. Sorry, I had an idea. As it's written academic in the first line, I was wondering if it would be compulsory, mean obligatory, to have students in science take classes of art within their 4 years or 3 years of study, not a course of the history of art, no, really doing artistic projects. And then the other side, to have those who study in art to really have some experience in laboratory or something, so that they feel from the moment they're studying that the two are linked.
I'll give you your money afterwards for the.
I mean, interestingly, at least we were talking in the car on the way over here, and at least for the two of us, like I studied music and science, and David studied, humanities, philosophy, and science. So at least from the two of us, you're talking to two people who really did something at least akin to that, of having those two pieces in relation to one another. And I would say, I don't know if you would agree, but I think we're somewhat outliers in the science world of pushing the boundaries of what, a normal scientist would be. And maybe some of that is from that training, or maybe we went into that training because that's who we were, but there's a piece of that for sure.
Because in Concordia University, in the same building, they have art and engineering. So when students take the elevator, I guess sometimes they talk to each other.
That would be great. Yeah. I'll put my CV for Mikhail. Yes. Before, there's another question a little bit more to the front. Yes.
Yeah, this conversation has really brought to mind for me sort of philosophy as like a connecting factor between art and science. And I guess my question to you guys is, for science students and for students collectively, what topics in philosophy do you think might be most useful to inspire, that like if they're studying, might inspire them to kind of see connections and maybe work together from your perspective? Like what topics in philosophy would you maybe encourage students on the sciences or the arts to look into it further and communicate?
Well, ethics, I think, is something that scientists ought to be exposed to as a topic of philosophy. That's my first response to your question. And obviously, environmental ethics is a huge field. And an important one that I think some scientists are exposed to, but they're not necessarily required to learn about in their education. And I think that would probably be a good idea if that was more universally included.
Okay. So really, thank you for your thoughts. It's struck about 10 really raw nerves in each. So like, each question's not out there, but especially in the last 10 years, working close to the coffee industry with a sole focus of regeneration and the way coffee's produced for a climate solution, which makes perfect sense. And how that relates to all of this is this breakdown between different ways of thinking and like this unwillingness to build bridges between industry and producer, or between science and communicator. and but also just this really acute lack of common sense. So, like thinking of the places, like I also could name places where wonderful work is happening. But one of my questions is, where are people? Where are the people who are willing to like share the seats, share the stage, share the credit, share the responsibility, share the resources in order to make solutions happen? And so I feel like, Sugar, what's our next step in order to like build the broken pieces of, like I would say, society in my neighborhood, in my city, in this continent, and like I feel like the people who are really holding heavy levers are keeping the doors shut pretty tight. And like, how do you grapple with that when you're living in that merged world? Really, I'm just looking for any insights from just like the book. So, thank you.
What would you think are the spaces of communion, especially, for example, with the scientific community? Is there a way that, there could be an outreach from the general population?
And one of the things that struck me when I was looking across the hundreds of seeds that we had collected was, and I'm not going to get to your bad actors, which I'm trying to think of a way to cycle around to that. Maybe I'll get there eventually. But one of the things that always struck me was these projects that communities would take on with a particular goal in mind. And the one that's coming to mind are projects that were like, oh, we've got this, abandoned lot in this particular part of the city, and the neighborhood is going to come together and we're going to fix up that lot and make it a nice place to be. And then over the course of doing that, they would not only fix up that space, but they would sort of fix up, in essence, like the human relationships in their community in a way that just connected people. And so once they were done fixing up that lot, they had sort of built a collective that was like, all right, now what are we going to do? And they could take on whatever. Maybe it was a schoolyard greening project. Maybe it was a social justice project. And the way that some of these things sort of, by healing the community, created an opportunity and a ability to do something more. My hope, and I can't think of an example at the moment, but my hope is that then provides some strength to try to hold open the doors that, what I would call like bad actors are trying to hold shut, to retain power. Because if I'm not very powerful on my own self, but if I have a whole community of people, I'm a little bit more powerful. And if my community connects with another community, then we're even more powerful. And at some point that grows to a point where you can hold that door open. For me, that's where I see that sort of glimmer of hope. But it has to start with, somebody has to have the idea to want to green that little, abandoned lot and gather people together and have the impetus to do it, and the willingness to put in the time to start that first little step. And I think if I come all the way back around to the beginning, when I'm talking to my students and they're just experiencing this massive climate grief, it sometimes is so heavy they don't have the energy to do that. And so, that brings me back to the place of like, oh, but, this person did it over there in their neighborhood, and you can go talk to them. And yes, it was hard and it took some work, but, then it felt really good, or somebody else took over or whatever. But that's at least for me where I see that the glimmers of holding the door open.
Yeah, I mean, you ask a great and really big question, and I don't feel like I have the answer to how do you prevent bad actors and change the world. But I one thing that gives me a lot of hope, as I've traveled around and given talks about these kinds of topics, is that there's an awful lot of young people who are really aware and really concerned and sort of not that scared. I mean, you do see this climate grief, but I also see a lot of young people that are sort of willing to engage and wanting to, that are solution focused, and not just in the U.S. I gave a few talks at universities in India, and there were just hordes of young people that were so into learning and solving problems, and you just talk to them and they'll be like, yeah, after I graduate here, I'm gonna do a startup that, we're gonna turn algae into, energy and food and whatever. Just like kids with ideas that are really smart and are growing up in this world where they realize these problems. And I feel like if we almost sort of get out of their way or give them some encouragement, because as Elena says, a little bit of success in some kind of solution is empowering in all these ways and leads to more boldness and taking on more projects, and it can kind of snowball. So that's what gives me hope, is that there is a natural impetus there among lots of people, lots of young people, to want to solve problems, and we're not starting from scratch. We just sort of need to encourage certain strong tendencies that already exist. And by the way, speaking of seeds, I remembered the name of Kinnery's book. So Kinnery Webb, who's this incredible person that Elena was describing, her project of sort of health and harmony, fixing forests by empowering people and healthcare and so forth. Her book is called Guardians of the Trees. And it's really worth checking out and kind of inspiring in this way of stories of people that really found a solution and that's working.
I think I can answer your question in two different ways. The first one would be to give you names of specific organizations that would have the leadership for you to include yourself or for you to follow that path, like Climate Change Reality, which is the organization that Al Gore founded. There is a Montreal chapter for that. There's other, organizations like, for example, Wildlife Conservation Society, that you can just, see what kind of roles would be for lay people or for people that are not exactly included in what their mission is, and just follow their leadership. Or even, Asia of Union, we're in a place that it's built on that energy as well. My second answer to that is, I could, as an artist, I could just be painting flowers in my studio right now, right? I am one person with one idea 5 years ago, thanks to David's book, that think at a certain moment, I need to, I'm thinking about social issues, but, I need to think of the environment and ecology. And it ended being a project that reunited 50 different artists and scientists and people from different walks of life, all working towards the same goal, which is to change the way that we relate to the environment, and not just ecological environment, but social environment in a positive way. So I think that, if you don't find the community, you can create one from your own, and most importantly, from your own purpose and your own perspective. I didn't need to become Greta Thunberg to have an effect. I just needed to do it through my own way, through my own passion, and through the way that I look at life, which is artistic, and have that effect. I think that's really important to realize, or the big lie is that you need to become someone that goes to a museum and spreads paint over, a famous painting to save the world. And that's not the only option. The best option is that you find what your passion and your calling is, and then you redirect that towards your circle of influence. Because the people that I work with in this project that maybe were not aware of what it means to have social or ecological sustainability in their own work, now they are aware of that. And the next time that they work with someone, with another artist, with another scientist, they're going to try to do that change. So there is sort of a very close circle impact that you can have just by being yourself a way in which the message spreads, but that message is going to also spread further and further and further until it has a global impact. I don't know if there's any last words from you, because we have to wrap up, but I don't know if there's anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to. No, you're good.
Yeah. Just thanks so much for including us and for arranging this and hosting this discussion. It's been really fun and I hope useful. And thank you all for your contributions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for the great conversation. I think I was very excited for this conference because of this idea of linking art with science, and I really think that that's what the mission of Age of Union is. And this very unique place, a lot of people ask us, what is it? And I think it's what this conversation is about. So thank you for assisting today. The center is open till 6, so you can go talk about science in the artworks, or you can talk about art in the science section. The panelists are going to stay here for a few minutes to answer your questions in private. And just so you save the date, the next open doors are going to be July 15 and August 19. So it's the last 2 open doors of this season. So thank you so much for coming, and hope to see you again soon.